begin. To the people who were on a few minutes ago, probably heard me say, yes, we will have a little more Leonardo. Circumstances conspired to make this happen, plus my conscience kicked in as well. Why would I show you Marcel Duchamp's Mona Lisa again? It's I want to just wrap up something last time about the subsequent fortune of works by Leonardo. So you remember that this painting, which is everywhere now, and that's why Duchamp was satirizing it by taking this postcard and putting it together as a work of art and defacing it in the way posters tend to be defaced, with a mustache and a little tiny goatee. That this is a painting that was not at all famous until around the beginning of the 20th century. So its fame came about primarily by happenstance. Looking at it, I encourage you to just decide for yourselves if you think, I mean, not this, but at the Mona Lisa, whether in reproduction or when you have your 1 minute in front of it and looking at the Louvre, whether you see in that a masterpiece as well. And that is because in the New York Times this week, there was a review of a new book. Let me give you the exact title. What the Ermine Saw, The Extraordinary Journey of Leonardo da Vinci's Most Mysterious Portrait. So this is now another one that's being put forward as it's possibly the most mysterious. I had toughed it out with myself and said, no, I wasn't going to show you this one before, but now I have the excuse to. This is a woman named Cecilia Gallerani, and she was one of the mistresses of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. The painting is not as accessible to people because it's in the museum in Krakow, but the new book on it is tracing the history of the painting of the woman, the subsequent history of this painting, when, like many works by great artists, became part of the spoils of war during World War II, and it was hidden in a salt mine and then rediscovered by the monuments men. So it has a very interesting history, and it's an interesting painting. So the author, Collinsworth, she wrote, I think it's The Portrait of the Lady in Red, or maybe it's just in gold. Maybe it's called The Woman in Gold. So she has just fiction and nonfiction, and she sometimes concentrates on single works of art. So Leonardo is back in the news now. And that same spirit of compunction leads me to bring back in The Last Supper, to make explicit that unlike the Mona Lisa, this painting never lost a shred of its fame. And that is really remarkable because it was just a wreck, a retouched, recovered, filthy wreck, which then at some long time was actually covered with cloth. And the fame of this endured, partly because from the very beginning, there were artists who began to copy it and recopy it, and sometimes trying to do fairly faithful copies of it, others using it as inspiration. Rubens uses it as inspiration. Rembrandt made drawings from it. No painting do we have that comes explicitly from this. But I suppose if you ask most of the public now to visualize the Last Supper, if they're thinking in terms of art, this is the image that will come. This is just dominant. And what made it so dominant is that here you have that extraordinary capacity of this man to think through the actual events. There's nothing that suggests he was particularly religious in orientation, but just imagine the story, the characters of the actors, and then to present something that is a totally beyond reality drama, which we accept as more real. So the figures are expressed in their gestures, what their character is like, and in their size and the extravagance of their motions and of their emotions. It's easy to understand. We can immediately empathize with them. The composition, which could be really complicated with 13 people, is so lucid and so easy to figure out. And you're always led right back to the center. So it has, it really is the dominance of Leonardo's mind over the subject matter and his great artistic mind in this as well. And again, Andy Warhol's, one of his 100 versions of it, the one called Last Supper Dove. Why? This also was in the news this week. It is right now on exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum, where until the 19th of June, there's an exhibition just called Andy Warhol Revelation, exploring the presence of Andy's deep faith in the art he did throughout his career. I mean, he never, like most things that really mattered to him, he kept it close. He didn't reveal it except in rather sly or hidden ways, as I pointed out in this one, where you have why it would be the dove. Well, it's for the dove of the Holy Spirit, and GE because that's light. And if you go to see the show, you also consider that you don't need to agree, but consider the fact that Andy is actually a very fine painter. So that's topical. And what else did I want to show you is where there's a lot more general, non-art interest in Leonardo, but where, again, you can see the extraordinary detachment. Here, I mean, how you can present an ideal world and be detached from the world is something I grapple with. I don't understand. But it shows you just a series of his drawings that emphasize the sort of the different poles of his concerns. This one on this exceptionally sweetly beautiful female head, that we know is for a drawing that he was doing for a painting that's been lost, but there are many copies of the painting survive of Leda and the Swan. So it's a theme out of classical antiquity. But his love of curves, we're going to find again and again there in the braids and in the hair. And he must have so much pleasure drawing that line. So there's great female beauty. Something else from classical antiquity, which I assume is probably the best known of all the drawings of his Vitruvian Man. Well, Vitruvius was a Roman architect, but in his architecture, he talked about in his writings, his treatise, he wrote about the ideal proportions of a person, a man, could be, it fits, you could circumscribe either a square or a circle around it, a circle if the arms are outstretched and the legs straddle. So Leonardo is experimenting with that. And those scholars who have studied this page said, but you know, he did not use exactly Vitruvian proportions. This is his own concept of the ideal man, but that's what the basis of that is. It's most likely here he's playing with his ideas, but of the ideal old man and the ideal young man. And of course, you've got the contrast of one with the other. How important are shadows for him? Look at how even around the face, not just in the figure. He builds it out through having shadow behind it. So you have ideal figures, ideal beauties from the exterior, and then with all his study of anatomy and dissection, well, here he's taking a skull and he takes it down level by level. So to make an arm move absolutely correctly, he wants to understand how the muscles, how the tendons connect, what ones come to the fore as motion takes place. So he takes studies all the way through. At the top, you might make out he will do some drawings separately. He sees the sort of the architectural structure of the back of the neck there. So we have youth, age, and then toward the end, he's very interested in just human procreation. I mean, he does a kind of an amusing drawing of a couple engaged in intercourse, trying to figure out how exactly bodies would mesh together and just the whole process. But then he dissected some fetuses, and he does these drawings, and then he does one where actually he puts the fetus in a cow's uterus for the drawing. Who knows why that is? But so he just wants to know, how does it fit? How does the umbilical cord fit? Where does it work? And with great dispassion, he shows someone from a public hanging in Florence. This is a man who was a conspirator in a partly successful assassination attempt against members of the Medici family. And here he does his face down here. And weapons of war that he invents. Look at this truly diabolical creation with these sort of like scythes that rotate around so that not only you safer on a horse, but now your galloping horse can mow people down before and behind you. So he's showing the dismembered bodies back here. So that's all of life and death. Then it's all of creation. Well, look at this cat, playful cat. This looks more like a sheep to me than a cat, but the rest is quite recognizably cat-like. And plants. What could be more ordinary and more of a pest than sedge, which is a weed? And here it is, drawn with great care. And then the mechanical world, not just the natural world. A lot of these are involved with it's arranging the flow of water. That's for canals. He wanted to divert the Arno and also to get water to places that had not gotten water before. And monsters. He did a wonderful lot of drawings of just marvelous monsters he creates. And this is the last one I show you. Toward the very end of his life, he did a series on the ultimate flood, as if the world is to be destroyed in a flood. And whether it's thinking in terms of the deluge and the story of Noah, but with his lack of deep religiosity, it may be that that's the source of thinking of the story, but anyway, it is his preoccupation. And here you see rocky cliffs tumbling down, and there's trees down here, human life down here, utterly submerged in a terrifying force. Now, there will be only one other time when we see, I shouldn't even promise this, one other time I believe that you'll be looking at anything from Leonardo, when we look at something where there was a competition between him and Michelangelo. But other than that, now we go to Michelangelo. A Florentine also. You can see he's not quite 25 years younger than Leonardo. So when he grows up, Leonardo is already the dominant, the giant of the artistic world. Michelangelo having extraordinarily long life. Look at that. And this is a drawing done when he was about 70 by one of his very faithful friends and pupils, a man named Daniel Volterra. But this is, one has to assume, here you are looking at the man, Michelangelo, with his most characteristic feature, which you might sense when you look at the shape of his nose. He had his nose bashed in when he was a young student. So he's from a Florentine family, a family that had been a fairly important family more than 100 years before Michelangelo's birth. But and they had been in banking and in government, but the family had suffered a lot of financial reverses. So they were living in a world of past glory, or the knowledge of past glory. When Michelangelo was born, he was one of 4 or 5 children. And then his mother died when he was 6. His father remarried, sired several other children, and that wife died too. So he was part of a big brood, but one of the early children. None of this would necessarily affect his art if it weren't for the fact that the money was not available for him to have the education that was due for someone of his standing, or the family's social standing. So it also accorded with his own interest, because he was interested in the arts. And his father sent him then in his youth to be apprenticed as an artist. And he was apprenticed to a painter. And we'll look at a little about that in just a second. But while we have this, I want to continue to look at this marvelous drawing before we go on with that. So he was apprenticed as a painter to a painter, to a man named Ghirlandaio, who happened to probably have been a pupil of Verrocchio. So there's this indirect connection with Leonardo, but that's a very diffuse link between the two of them. Now, in most biographies of Michelangelo, you're going to read that he studied with the painter for a year before he moved over and concentrated in sculpture. That is because Michelangelo had the good fortune of having 2 people write his biography during Michelangelo's own lifetime. And Michelangelo fiddled with the truth. to make sure that he comes out in the best possible light in all situations. So Michelangelo actually worked with in the painter's studio for probably 3 years before he then was invited to by one member of the Medici family to come over to was the Medici's gardens. Now, what would going to the gardens have to do with being an artist? The Medicis were doing as families in Rome, as ancient families had done. They had collections, or owners of Roman villas did in the time of Pompeii. They had scattering of fine sculpture in their gardens so that people could walk around and have learned or relaxed conversations and enjoy the art and enjoy culture. Well, so the Medicis had established a garden like that in Florence, and they had acquired as many antiquities, buying from Rome, ones that were showing up in Italian soil elsewhere. So they had those scattered around. And then the Medicis were making these available so that youngsters could learn how to carve, so that they could learn to emulate the great works of antiquity. And there was a sort of a senior aged sculptor named Bartoldo who worked there and gave them some guidance. And that's where Michelangelo will go. But let's, this is at the Met. The same man who did that drawing, a man named Daniele von Volterra, did a bronze sculpture portrait of Michelangelo. And then this is maybe a painting by him, but there are many, many, many copies of this, so that this becomes the slightly more dignified version than this one, because I still haven't told you what happened. Well, he's over working in the, first of all, he was practically kicked out of Ghirlandaio's studio because he did something that outstripped what Ghirlandaio had done. And Michelangelo pointed out that he had done a better job. Well, Ghirlandaio, who was one of the most notable artists of his time, like Botticelli, why are you going to keep a kid around who's going to mock you like that? So then Michelangelo is over in the gardens, and there's a well-born, very handsome young man who was studying sculpture. And he and Michelangelo were great rivals. And at some time, Michelangelo is making fun of something this guy does. And then he hauled off and socked him and broke his nose. Years later, he was still proud of the fact that he broke Michelangelo's nose. But, that's the nature of this man. He is irascible in the extreme. Canny, money grubbing, duplicitous, and fantastic. So this is a chapel in a church in Florence, which was in the process of being painted during the years when Michelangelo studied with Ghirlandaio. And here's a scene that probably, who knows, Michelangelo may have been helping to prepare for this particular scene, because he was there in this in the workshop in the year we know this particular panel is done. The reason I bring it in is because the legend that then develops is that when Michelangelo paints the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he had no experience. I mean, that's part of his genius, that he just suddenly started to do this most impossible thing. Well, no. He had been around people in Florence. He knew, and he had he later will take assistance from Florence. So he knew the fresco tradition. He knew other people who could help him out. It wasn't quite such a one-man job as that. Now, this fresco in Florence, I hope a lot of you have seen. Anyone who's had Italian Renaissance art history has certainly seen. It's called the Brancacci Chapel, and by a man named Masaccio, who's often credited as being sort of, if you had to have a single founder of Renaissance painting in Florence, you'd say it's this man, and particularly for the figures in the upper panel here. This Adam and Eve, and this a really atypical religious scene of one of Jesus's miracles when he's asked to pay to enter a city, and he tells Peter to go over to a fish, and in the fish's mouth they'll find a coin, and then Peter will pay off the tax collector. It was bankers who paid for this. Brancacci's were bankers. But it's this scene that we're interested in right here, where Peter, you could see, is just thrusting that coin into the hand of the tax collector. I couldn't figure out how to, I know it's possible, I couldn't figure out how to show two scenes simultaneously. So, but it is this figure of Peter that Michelangelo drew when we still have the drawing from. So Michelangelo has the instinct to go right back to the founders, the first Renaissance artists, the towering geniuses, rather than just his teacher, and to learn what did they have to offer him. So we'll look at this, but I will tell you right now, when we look at the Michelangelo drawing, to look at the difference, the way his head sits on his shoulders, how this arm just comes straight down, and this cloak is sort of oddly heaped up right there. And oh, these are wonderful folds in this fabric, but they don't really help you figure out. So where would his hips be? Where's his knee? You know, just how does this leg, because it looks like it's straight, how does it join with the torso? And there's Michelangelo's drawing, pen drawing. This is a technique he'll use all his life long. He does this, builds up this shadow by these hatching lines going back and forth. Look at the difference in the character now that you get when the head is somewhat separated, and get the angle and the gesture, and you can see some slight bend in the arm here. There's a fully realized person. Which the innovator hadn't, as a novelist, doing what even no one else could do, he had not achieved. But Michelangelo saw what he was trying to do and does it in that drawing. So now we look at sculptures. This one is in the Met. It's called sometimes Archer ? It's like, don't really know what the subject is of this. It's just a little figure. It's not quite 3 feet high. Oh, here it is, the back view. This is a little bit like the Mona Lisa. This is a figure whose author had disappeared over time. There were documents you can sort of trace for a time that Michelangelo had done when he was a young teen when he did this. It was around 1490. Oh, not such a young teen then. But then it disappeared. It was bought to decorate the Whitney Mansion on Fifth Avenue. And it was the Whitney Mansion, which is now the cultural offices of the French embassy. And this decorated a fountain. And someone knew, upon looking at this, they said, I believe this is Michelangelo. And so, yeah, it is. So this fluency with the bodies and bodies in motion and his skill as a sculptor, that's it. It's there. At one point, Michelangelo wrote, he said, to him, sculpture means, well, I think I wrote this down somewhere. By sculpture, I understand that which is done by the sheer force of taking away. That is, which is done by addition, is more like painting. So he will do works in bronze, which are based on clay models. So he did do additive sculpture well, but primarily he is one who uses his chisels and his rasps and works on stone. But here's I want to talk very briefly about some of the issues in working with stone. I couldn't find all the examples that would help me as I wanted, but in a moment, we're going to look at a relief sculpture done by Michelangelo that's quite extraordinary for its being a student work. And I want to give you just some idea of the typical procedure in working in a relief sculpture by looking at a Roman sarcophagus. I would say that this looks to me like it's in a field in Turkey, one that's half done, because you can still make out the procedure used by a workshop, that there would be on the surface of the block a very rough drawing of the design. And then you would hack away the stone. And most of the time you were thinking of it, you would be carving back to say, 10-inch depth. So then, since there wasn't going to be anything else, you could just cut back to that 10-inch, and then this will be all smoothed. So that's, you see what's been done here. So this is what pupils would be doing. This is the most menial labor. That's just really just using the tool. And then there would be someone with either greater practice or just greater skill, then would be doing something like the bunch of grapes, where you are working at slightly varying depths, starting, of course, at the front and then working back. And then you know where your background is. The same thing here. These will be then refined into leaves and fruits and berries in these rough forms. Or there's another way of working, which was largely started by Donatello less than a century earlier. Now, this is by Michelangelo, and it's called Madonna of the Steps or Madonna of the Stairs. It's about 1491. And it's called just a low relief, because these are like almost wafer thin layers when you're going back. And if you want to suggest something that goes back in space, like these little cherubs are to be way back, or this one is on a step, you can't do anything that's actual physical approximation. You have to really work this almost as an illusion, that this is cut back and then this comes forward a little bit so that you have room to cut back again. It comes forward a little bit to cut back a little more. But as you look at it, it looks more as if it were a painted version and you're going back and back and back. Well, he's just learning this, and it's, as I'm sure you're understanding, it's quite difficult. So he doesn't really handle her thigh very well. That's just pretty flat. He doesn't know how to suggest that curve. And here, this foot isn't long enough, and he didn't, and well, it just doesn't work. But his ambition to show a spiraling, twisting, contorted figure as this Christ child about to nurse with an arm twisted around behind that, or this, we don't know if this is just cherub here, on a stair with one leg, the knee bent forward, the leg over, the head turning back again. He's trying things that are extremely complicated. And it's various stages of completion. You know it's behind glass. You can see that from reflection. In the natural world, what matters to Michelangelo is the human body. He will attend dissections, but he's not interested in how the body works. I mean, what the circulatory system is or the digestive system. He wants to know about what then will ultimately affect the muscles and the skeletal structure. No, this is not Michelangelo either, but this is a Roman sarcophagus. It was still underground in Michelangelo's lifetime. But this is about what the Romans, with their long years of practice and workshops full of this would be sort of the apogee of what they could do in a relief. So there are forms one behind another, but even the one thing to notice that all these figures, they're sort of like on the same plane as the front of the stone would have been. So you could have had a drawing and then you would carve back to this and carve back to this too. There might have been some secondary drawings that you could follow. But there's nothing that sort of like goes back in depth in itself. And then look at what Michelangelo does. Unfinished, probably, well, many of his sculptures are unfinished, but the presumption here is that he left it unfinished so that his sort of skill, his prowess would be more obvious. It's small also, it's 3 feet by not quite 3 feet, a piece of marble, and it shows a classical Greek story of the Battle of the Lapith, Lapith, in Centaurs, those half human, half equine creatures, Centaur. It was a favorite story, not only because it shows, well, to the Greeks, their favorite beings, both human beings and horses, but because it has a great moral to it. And it's a very, well, it appears on the Parthenon even. The moral is humanity's superiority over all beasts, because the half horse creatures attended a wedding of a Lapith woman, and the centaurs got drunk. And in their drunkenness, they tried to abduct the Lapith women. And so here you have the Lapiths then battling with the centaurs. He's so interested in the human beings. This is about the only centaur you can see. And that's a kind of weird looking centaur down here, because there's the horse's tail, horse's rump and hoof. And this is the upper body. With you soon. So much fun. But now in this, he has them coming forward, going back. They're not all parallel to the front surface. And there's no way he could have drawn a series of drawings and following this out. This he did by means certainly not understood by me, and I think understood by most people, how he had some people say he just had the wisdom in the chisel, that it knew where to carve, how to use the space, how to build forms on one another. And what an opportunity to exercise human bodies in all positions. I have some details of this one over here, but see what you can over at this section. Sometimes, you really have to work to figure out exactly, this is the back, this is the arm of this figure here. Here one's slumping forward, that's more straightforward. Well, the knee comes forward. We'll look at this. See, it doesn't project very much. And even the unfinished state, there's pathos and expression of various sorts in these. So this is the teen. All right, so he's still working in the gardens. And with some friends, he gets up to mischief. He decides to create carve a sleeping Cupid, which was also a very popular classical. There are a lot of Roman sleeping Cupids. That's a theme of, love gone wrong. So he carved one, making it look very ancient, and they buried it in the soil so it was grimy. And then they took it up and they wanted to sell it as an ancient sculpture. Now, they wouldn't try to sell it in Florence because the Florentines were too savvy with their art. They took it to Rome and they sold it to a cardinal, a man named Riario, who had a profound passion.
Are there any problems that we should worry about?
No.
Excuse me, someone.
I can't hear you. What?
She's just by herself right now.
Excuse me. You need
just went to lunch.
I'm sorry.
Someone needs to mute. They sold it to this Cardinal Riario, who had amassed a wonderful collection of the greatest in Rome of antiquities. And Michelangelo went down to Rome. And he told Cardinal Riario what he'd done, thinking that he could.
I've gone through several phases with this. When I went to an endocrinologist a few years ago.
Excuse me. I don't have the power, I think, to mute everybody. So
Oh, I'm sorry.
You need to do that. He went to Cardinal Riario and confessed to doing this, not out of any sense of guilt, but he thought he could get more money. Well, Riario didn't pay him anymore, but he didn't send him to. He could have imprisoned him for this fraud. He didn't. Instead, he hired him to. He had Michelangelo look at all the work he did, and then he gave a commission to Michelangelo to produce this figure of a Bacchus. Bacchus is same as Dionysus, the god of wine. This is done by a northerner who visited Riario's gardens years later. And you could see how this just a collection of fragmentary antiquities. And then Michelangelo's sculpture is at home right there in the middle of them. So now, very quickly, hear about carving a full-scale figure. So you start with your block of stone and you draw on it what the form is that you're going to work down to. And you use a lot of chisels and then finer and finer tools as you go along, sort of working out the transition from one side to the other, unless like the ancient, well, wait a minute. And if you were doing a large figure, sometimes you started even sort of blocking it out while it's still in the quarry, while it's still attached to the soil. This is in a Greek island. It's a colossal statue. It's going to be a standing nude man. You see his feet down there. Person stands about this high. So who's going to want to ship all that stone? So you get it blocked out one way or the other, working from the front and working from the sides. And Egyptians often left their figures that way because that is the most solid, permanent, unbreakable form. And for a person who's to survive throughout eternity in their statue, that's the way to go. So here are a couple of Roman statues of the god Dionysus, the god of wine. There are certain features other than the grapes. He's always shown as the sort of the most epicene, the sort of the youngest, the least athletic, slightly more indolent figure. That one was found in North Africa. Or you might have him with his companions, like little satyrs, as this goat-legged figure is. This also Roman, and I wanted to point out this, another feature, keeping in mind about matters of sculpture. if you have a figure that's going to lean way over, as this one is, you certainly have to have adequate support at the base. Well, here, that's why you have trees fastening onto this figure, or why he's all the way over here. So you have sufficient at the ground, and you don't want to get too far, too extravagant an outline, because all this would be stone that you had to cut away. That's all waste. So this is what Michelangelo does. He does it. It's let's see, it's almost 7 feet high with its base. Base maybe about 1.5 feet high. And it's in Florence in the Bargello now, instead of in Rome. Well, he does not present the classical god. He thinks of someone who's tipsy. And he dares to show throughout the body the slightly wavering pose, not the fixed and free leg standard pose of a Greek statue. And I'm going to do what makes teaching about sculpture so extremely difficult when you're not in front of the reality, because you're meant to being able to see this, to walk all the way around it. Well, we'll look at the various views we have. Nor does Michelangelo, use the ideal nude body. He here seems to have a slightly plump adolescent male model who's posed for him, and he shows that. This is the only view I could find that shows him straight on from the front. You have the sense he's looking at his wine cup here, and quite blurrily. I mean, he's really having to work to concentrate. This is tricky because you have to figure out how to balance it in this pose with belly forward, shoulders back, to just get the balance. You're trying to balance a figure that you're wanting to show simultaneously is unbalanced in himself. And oh, how perfectly he does. He knows the transitions here, the muscles, they're superb. Even the difference in the buttocks and the fixed and free leg pose. And most Greeks and Roman sculptures don't do that. Here he's the mature artist. He's conquered it. He's got it. And what commission does he get after this? This is 1488, 89. Oh, yes, one other view. Oh, dear. I hope you're not seeing what I'm seeing there. Is this. So he did the Bacchus, he was 21. Now, when he's 23, 24, he gets a commission from a French cardinal who was ambassador in Rome at this time to create a figure grouping of the Pietà. Pietà, which means pity, is the story of Mary holding the body of her son after he's just been lowered from the cross at the crucifixion. This was to go on the cardinal's tomb. And it was in a chapel that was adjacent to St. Peter's. But when St. Peter's was rebuilt, that chapel was destroyed, and it didn't take its place where we all know it to be in the St. Peter's until the 19th century. And this is, of course, what it looks like now, hidden behind bulletproof glass, and you cannot get close to it. It came to the US. Again, I'm wondering if some of you saw this. In the 60s, it came to the World's Fair. Oh my goodness, was it wrapped? It was even in something that on the ship, if the ship went down, there was things that would make sure that this would float so they would be able to get it. And there's a fantastic packing job in there. Oh, next time we'll do that. Let's do it now. So here you are, trying to get a picture of it. But fortunately, we have some older photographs. I think this is one of those times again when here first I'm just saying, oh, be sure you're muted. You can unmute and tell me what you notice about this. Anybody wants to. If you don't, I will just take you into it then. It is a wonderfully moving image. We don't know exactly how high off the ground it was meant to be seen. If it was this high, or I brought in as many different angles as possible. And possibly this is a good one. Now you could see there's that triangular shape of the figures, and you can kind of sense the shape of the block of the marble he used. But it's if you just take it as a composition, I'll do a little and then we'll come back to the composition. So on this side, you have this great curve. It's like a parenthesis, this drapery of her robe, and the curves come in, and Christ's head fits right in with it. Then on this side, you have her protruding hand, his protruding foot, protruding rock. So it's not symmetrical triangle, and you have it's not a symmetrical contour. She wears enormous robes because he's aware of what Leonardo has introduced as possibilities. And those enormous robes do not entirely conceal her body, because the crease right here lets you know, well, there's her knee, and they're just her toes stuck here. You have a form that's like this, encapsulates the lower leg. And very rumpled bodice, but her breasts are still visible there. Fantastic carving. Look at the hollows under here. And then his body completely integrates that curve, this curve, his hand, the fingers almost like negligently just on either side of that curve. So it follows into it. And you notice that Michelangelo has made sure that you can see all of the figure, even if it's at a higher level like this, so that Christ's left leg is propped up on a piece of rock. So it rises a little bit above. And then his hand on that. So you see hand, hand, dead hand, living hand. Nothing of pain, nothing of torment. This is a devotional image. It's not meant to be a historical image. Look, she never touches his flesh. She has holding cloth there, but how that moves his flesh, his deeply sunken abdomen. all the aspects of his kneecap. And of course, this is what I wanted you to get to on your own, which I probably did, is that the extreme, extraordinary unreality of one adult holding another on a lap, the other one inert body. Now, this image, this idea, they're called Vesper sculptures. They were pretty common in Northern Europe, not really in Italy. In the Middle Ages, this is one that's in the mat. They saw no, they had no issue with making both figures life-size, because it was an era where the devotional, emotional aspect was far more important than the rational, which was the Renaissance point of view. So in the Renaissance, this kind of pose just doesn't occur. And here's a Bohemian one, whereas interestingly, the image of Christ is made very small, but there was actually some mystical writing that would explain this, saying that Mary, in her grief, was transported back into just thinking that she was having her infant son in her lap. But Michelangelo was able to carry it off. And then what you see when you look at an odd angle like this is like, oh my goodness, look at those spindly legs and how very short those legs are. You don't sense it there. This is the only work he ever signed on this band along here. It says Michelangelo Buonarroti Florentine. He's immensely proud of being Florentine all his life in Rome. Made this. Legend is anyway that it was only carved on there after he heard other people admiring the sculpture and saying that it was done by someone else, because it obviously could not have been by Michelangelo. See, now her knee here is up higher because it's propped up on a piece of rock. So it gives a plausible reason, but look at those wonderful folds of cloth. Flipping over, turning, pooling, and the deep shadows. Cascading there, and oh my goodness, there. The unreality that affected people at that time, and that Michelangelo defended, was that Mary is so youthful. There's a kind of a theological interpretation that he wasn't applying to it, evidently, which is that she represents the mother church holding her son. Michelangelo said it was that this shows that essentially she'd never, that shows that she was a virgin. So she'd never had the cares of intercourse and childbearing by normal means. But he's really trying to make an ideal face. Look at this. Now, carving little things like that, you have to take a drill and go deep in, and then he smoothed it off with files. I mean, it's extraordinarily challenging. It's the kind of work a young person can do with a kind of great manual dexterity. very discreet with the wounds. And let's see. So from several years before that, well, just man, going from doing the Bacchus to doing this, you get some idea of the not only his skill, but the complexity and the sort of the human depth in him, that he can take subjects that are so different from that and present such plausible, deeply thought out imagery. Well, next time, oh, there's the Michelangelo. We will do this, and we will spend a lot of time on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, because we are just at the beginning of his career. But we are at the end of the time, and as usual, I invite comments, questions. And especially if there's anyone who, before I stop the screen share, is there anyone who wants me to go back to anything?
Maggie,
Yeah.
in the picture with the Pieta, where you pointed out a little something at the top of his thigh, right near her body, what was that?
Let's see. It's these folds,
Oh,
which are very interesting little pattern in themselves. But you see that's carved way deep back in there. I mean, he's like, that's a lot of work, a lot of work to do that.
so those are folds of her gown, or?
That's his loincloth right there.
Oh, okay.
And then this is hers, where he really riffs on it. Look at that through there, amazing. Anyone else? Yeah, all right,
Yeah, I have a question. This
go for it.
would this have been painted like ancient statues?
No. By this time, they had almost completely lost the knowledge that ancient sculpture had been painted, because when it was coming up out of the soil, the paint had been worn off. So no, they didn't. Any more? All right. See you next week.
Thank you.
Yes. Goodbye.
Thank you. She's really so good.
Thank you, Maggie.